my biggest surprise throughout these years dedicating myself to this is that, meeting some really powerful leaders. And when I have the chance, I ask them, what's your utopia? What's your end game? Super simple question. And they don't have an answer.
Everybody in the world has to decide whether you stand on the side of the free world or you stand on the side of those who fight against the free world. Who fight against the free world. And we are standing here on the side of the free world. This is a moment of truth.
Hello and welcome to another episode of This Time Tomorrow. This is the podcast that brings together democracy defenders to see how we can win out against rising autocracy. My name is Omri Price and I'm joined with Benny and Daniela today. Benny, how are you?
Hi, Omri. I'm coming to you from Munich today. Where
that
are
is
you, Daniela?
Surprising. Daniela, how are you doing?
I'm good, and I'm in the in-between point of Cologne. Busy week, end of the week.
Yes, wrapping things up, and I've had an interesting wake up at 4 a.m. So if I'm coming to you slightly scrambled, that's why. But maybe before we proceed, we should just take a moment to do our little promotional thing that needs to be a habit in every episode. The reason that we're doing this episode is really or this podcast at large, is to be able to basically put out a pro-democratic message out there, to have media that talks about the issues that matter, and to be able to compete online with the far right, which is extremely well networked and resourced in promoting this autocratic message that will eventually destroy our society. So please do click subscribe. Please do share, follow. Take a minute to send this podcast through to one or two friends, or a WhatsApp group, a Signal group, a Facebook group, whichever kind of groups float your boat. Do that, not just because you like us and this is really interesting, but because this might potentially save the world. So take a moment and just do that. We'll wait. And then today we have a really interesting conversation on our hands. We have Märtha Rehnberg with us. And Märtha is someone who's really engaged with the toughest and most interesting problems. She has been a futurist of sorts, someone who looks at the future and helps guide other smart people on how to deal with complicated emerging problems like emerging tech, climate, sustainability. She's consulted business leaders, companies, and so on about how to envision the future and move towards it. And that's why we want to talk to her today. And she's calling us from Copenhagen, which is also a place that has been at the center of the headlines. Märtha, how are you?
I'm good. I get thrown back to the first time I met you, Omri, in this sort of hyperbolic yet on point introduction of both podcast and self.
Yes, you're more than welcome. Hyperbolic and on point is something I could live with.
I guess reality is catching with the hyperbolic.
Yeah, I think reality is a little bit hyperbolic these days. Maybe that helps. And so thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I guess the time that we first met was a little bit over a while ago now, so I won't disclose how old we are.
Double digits.
But we were at this very fancy Swiss conference in St. Gallen, Leaders of the Future, the Symposium of Tomorrow, and we were there with a lot of important people from the finance sector mostly, and we were pitched as young people who were going to do important things. And then we started talking about all of these global issues, and we've sort of kept in touch since then. But maybe you can tell us a bit about like your background and your journey since you were like a master's student in political economy and then went on to do stuff. What have you been doing?
I think maybe that fancy conference in Switzerland isn't a bad way to start, come to think of it, because
Especially the news these days.
yeah, as political economists, one studies power and how power sort of floats between the market and the state. And technology wasn't really something that we looked at. I was sort of assumed to come to us by the engineers and science in this sort of linear division of labor value chain that the broader economy is built on. And as we know today, tech doesn't work that way. It works at different speeds and different scales when it's digital, and then it becomes exponential, right? And at that Swiss conference, I was like deep in I just came out of a deep sort of rabbit hole of thinking about machine learning algorithms, which wasn't really something that we thought was gonna be the future. It was really like Jeffrey Hinton, the godfather of neural networks. He was almost already laughed at back then, so we didn't know it was going to be. And I was like, okay, but if it does become the future, then we'll have a new power dynamic that we've never seen before between humans and non-humans, so artificial intelligence, and they'll produce answers that will take us millennia to sanity check when it's neural nets. And so I wrote an essay about it, and I stood on that stage in front of those policymakers and decisions. I mean, I've held, I think, 400 plus talks since then, but I've never had a talk to date that was more sort of senior and executive than that one. And it was my first time on a stage talking about sort of tech. And I was trying to sort of say that we need to all learn about tech, and tech should only be sort of the talks for the engineers and the scientists. We all need to develop what I call back then technological intuition. And I remember just standing there and like not really being understood. And so I think that's the backdrop for my little story about how I got into this. So I started to find this place, Dare Disrupt, which in essence is a playground, a think tank for understanding the new world and shaped by technology. And I think the world has come a long way since then. We can sort of double click on that as well. But that was sort of the brief intro, I think, for now. Many hats.
Yeah. So that was back in 2013, where machines were very different back then.
Yeah.
And we also did kind of a pre-conversation to this where you explained to me in an interesting way, and I'm going to paraphrase it so that we can dig deeper into it. But essentially what you've been doing over the last 10 years is working with business executives to develop storylines, right, and narratives about the future so that companies can understand what kind of future they want to live in, they want to get to, and then develop strategies on how to get there, right? Is that a good description of what you have been doing?
Yeah. I've definitely tried to sort of highlight the power of visions with both business executives, as you say, and policymakers. So I did the vision that was the backdrop for the EU industrial policy for 2 years. I worked with the vice president, the ex-vice president of the Commission, Jyrki Katainen. So that was also, so it's both policymakers and business leaders.
And how do you see, how do they take to it? Because what my impression is often when speaking with these with people who run companies is that they tend to see their job as adjusting to reality, right? It is, the environment is a thing. It is there are certain risks, there are certain opportunities, and the job is to essentially position and maneuver the company in a way that they can benefit in the best way, and they can avert and skirt the risks in the best way. Very rarely do you find a business leader who sees it as their responsibility to actually look at the future as something to be proactively built. Even though maybe, this would be the right approach, because, you might end up in the future where, all you can do is adapt, adjust, and comply. And eventually this hardens into a modus operandi where you just hand out your freedoms and your autonomy in an ever decreasing way until someday you end up in Russia, and then the next day you're pushed out of a window or something. So I feel that they don't seem to be to me not really a bunch that is overly receptive to this idea that they should take a very hands-on approach when it comes to shaping the future and making it into something that is really livable for everybody. But I might be completely surprised by your response, and there might be a more hopeful message from your experience.
I fear you won't be surprised. I think you're on point, and it's my biggest surprise throughout these years dedicating myself to this is that meeting some really powerful leaders, and when I have the chance, I ask them, "What's your utopia? What's your end game?" Super simple question, and they don't have an answer. And I feel sad, because in a way that's how we've educated leaders, and managers, not leaders, in this linear value chain. The artists think about visions. It feels like we've become really good managers that do things right, but leaders, they do the right thing. It's very different approach, and you have to be open to not be a reaction. What you're saying in essence is that we are reaction both to the status quo and the reality of the world, and then also a reaction to the heritage of our companies, if you will. So we feel we always have to protect the status quo in the company as well. And that's what I was taught as well in business school. I was taught, Porter's 5 forces. If anyone knows that, you start with your existing product, and then you try to see how to push that in the world, instead of starting with the world and starting with the future and say, okay, from that future and that world that we want to create, let's reverse engineer and to ask ourselves, the final question is, what product it needs to be produced to get us there. But often I see leaders, or as I want to call them, managers, going methodologically the other way, starting with their current portfolio and then trying to shape the world so that it works according to that.
Yeah. How do you think, Märtha, or also the others, how do you think this might change with this announcement a few weeks ago from von der Leyen about EU Inc., which is supposed to be the EU incorporated, the new, the pan-European solution for also startups? I mean, I think in my view, it's very welcome, but it's also a couple decades too late. I don't know if we can say too late, because it's always better now than never. But I mean, do you think that is now also one solution to get us also to a place where we can have much more digital sovereignty? I mean, I also think that there's been such a gap in not just the startups, but the products that we've created in Europe. I see the movement moving towards European products and European tech companies, but I'm struggling. I'm stuck on Google Docs, for example. I haven't seen a very good alternative yet. There's still some just products out there that is just, the American products are too convenient. Maybe that's one way I can say it. I'm trying to make the shift. But I don't know. I think that there's such a gap there. Maybe, how do you also see this? The people that you talk to that are saying, yeah, I'm trying to make the shift. I don't know if the products are fully there yet, or at least we're not aware of them yet. We also need to seriously scale them up. And do you think that this EU incorporated this solution is going to really help close that gap? And how long is it going to take is also the other question, because these things, startups, but it's not going to be from one day to the next. So things are moving too quickly on one side, right? But then, we really need to speed it up. I think time is not really on our side here.
Yeah. I mean, now we're jumping into big tech, all of a sudden, the big elephant in the room. I mean, definitely EU Inc. You need to remove transaction costs that are super high for a startup, making your market bigger so that you can reach network effects faster. Network effects is the most important thing, right, when we talk about digital tech. So absolutely, let's hope that that's an important piece for disruptive thinking, which, as you say, often resides mostly with startups. Although I also want to sort of challenge that assumption. But let's hope that our European startups have a larger market and lower transaction costs. But what we also can learn from the Americans is, going back to the point about visions, is, they want to save the world before breakfast. Then we can all talk about, do they really, or is it just jargon? And then what world is that they're talking about? But they're amazing marketing folks. They're amazing storytellers, and we need to learn there, because that has an immense power on creating the network effects. That is the reason we get scalable tech. And network effects isn't just sort of this tech thing about how to combine technologies and the data to get it, but why does a person want to be in one network over another? It's ease, it's a better product in these things, but it does start with a story, and it does start with a vision that attracts people, and all of a sudden you want to be in that network, and that's sort of where it takes off. So that's why when we analyze the future, we need to really account for the power of visions at the same time as sort of the more analytical sort of bits and zeros and ones that enable those visions to happen. And there's a tendency to analyze, going back to Benjamin's point about being a reaction to the world, is that we try to analyze the world and foresee it as it is, with technological sort of tendencies, with sort of tech is my epistemology. And we forget fully what is the visions that are driving technology in one direction over another.
Yeah, so I think what you said earlier on, in terms of, asking these CEOs, say, what is your utopia? And then what you would want to do is reverse engineer the product from the utopian vision, right? Which is it's a novelty approach, because we don't do that very often. Rather than, we tend to start with the product. I think, we can talk about the various solutions that Europe might have, like EU Inc., which would essentially be a European company, or lots of other tools that are maybe on the table. But, if we zoom out a bit from the business side and from the tech side of it, but just looking at the world today, with also the geopolitical issues and, kind of everything that we have around us, how do we have that conversation about what is our utopia? Like, where do you start fleshing that out? Because I think we spend a lot of the time being freaked out by the latest headline and the latest preposterous, horrible thing that has happened, and we don't necessarily take the time to say, okay, what's our utopian direction here, and how do we get there? So what would you, if you could workshop us, and a bunch of world leaders in a room right now, what would you do? Like, what's the method?
There's the creating the right sort of paranoia to get us equally uncomfortable at the same time, and to make sure that we dress off our titles really quick. That's like, when you meet leaders, you have to do this so quick. They're so busy, right? So, and this is why I mentioned tech as my sort of epistemology is not only for the tech to talk about, where to push the buttons and how it works scientifically, but because it makes us quite uncomfortable very fast. So tech like that is quite a powerful tool for starting an important conversation about, wait a minute, where do we want to go as a humanity, and meet ourselves at the level of humans. So it's a full-on sort of walk into a gallery of potential trajectories and potential futures, often that are not talked about, but that are happening. So, and from there, it's just yummy discussion as soon as we're sort of dressed off with our titles. But it's a grief to see that we don't create those spaces. It happens increasingly. If we go back to 2013 when we met, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the world was pretty in a rough space there, and it's just become worse in many ways. But we just, came out of the financial crisis. Arguably, we haven't still, and climate change was certainly also stressful back then. But luckily, I see, especially the last 2 years, an increasing willingness to take that existential level discussion and invest in it. and invest in creating those spaces. And there's a huge relief inside organizations when your leaders actually start saying that we want to invest in it. And it's been beautiful, especially this last year. It's been beautiful to really sense it in the room, how everyone in the organization individually is quite stressed. And then when you create that space, you can hear in the room collectively, okay, what are our leaders actually investing and voicing how effed up it is right now? Yes, they are. Good. It's safe.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, it's been beautiful.
I mean, that is one of my key concerns. So at what point will it make click, right? At what point? Because right now, what often appears to be the case is that looking at the future by simply extrapolating what you can see in front of you, this is what we call serious. This is serious people look at the world how it is, and we extrapolate trends, and we do that to project, how technology will develop and how markets will develop, and who's likely to win in elections. You look at trends and you extrapolate, and then that's what serious people do. And everything that's sort of more creative and utopian, that is kind of unserious stuff. That's sort of very youthful, playful, often ideological, bullshit, really, that serious people shouldn't take seriously. But if you look at the track record of the people extrapolating stuff, it ends up completely wrong. Like there's nothing, nobody could have predicted any of the things that actually ended up happening. Now, if you look just at a 3 to 4 year time horizon, you might as well, tossed a coin or, read some tea leaves or whatever. So I think the only rational and sensible way to go about it is a normative way. You need to look at where do you actually want to end up, and then do what you can to arrive at that destination, rather than constantly trying to predict stuff from a status quo that you then also pretend you can't really influence, but you need to adapt to how it develops. That thing is so when you say the people in the room are all paranoid and panicked, that actually sounds rather optimistic to me. And the question is, how much more of that can we get, and how can we put some logs on that fire of that paranoia, panic, and fear, so that people will finally stop pretending they can just safely calculate what will happen tomorrow, but that they will have to start sort of looking at the future in a completely different, more creative and more daring and more constructive way.
I mean, the timing for doing this type of work is fantastic. The data is out, the empirics is out, so we can just backcast and say, we couldn't have foreseen where we are. So then the same holds for the future, right? And the importance of stretching the cone of expected futures and try to play with the least probable trajectories and signals at the edge of our current sort of where we shed light on at the moment. So that's what you just started off with, Benjamin, is the perfect ammunition to start off. I mean, the world is ridiculous. So, and then the next question is, it's ridiculous in a way that scares people today. So what is the right kind of ridiculous? Here comes the normative. And, this is purely logics. It's symmetry, perfect symmetry. If the bad kind of ridiculous exists right now and is a possible trajectory, then the right kind of ridiculous needs to be true as well, right? So, and what is that? And how far can we take ourselves into stretching our dreams into what seems ridiculous? And then you have more data to support that as well. Like, there's so many things that we sit with today that started with someone who asked a ridiculous question or, formulated a ridiculous thesis. Quantum computing builds on quantum mechanics. I mean, the first couple of scientists that started, proposing that one subatomic particle could be in two places at the same time, superposition, they were laughed at. And yet that's at the basis of so many inventions today. And, Nobel Prize laureates are being granted to quantum physicists that have proved all these weird, wacky things. So it starts with brave people playing with ridiculous thoughts, and that's what we need to do, and not just scientists that get Nobel prizes, but the average Joe needs to start playing with the ridiculous stuff at the edge.
Indeed.
Yeah, and so to me, I think we need to find a way to sort of evangelize this kind of thinking, or to do some of that kind of thinking collectively. So in a sense, exactly as Benny said just there, how do we get away from this very wrong-headed approach to realism of just sort of looking at what's there and, you know, imagining that it will be exactly the same tomorrow, and actually going like, no, this is where I want to go, and then what do I do in order to get there? Have you seen examples of that switch happening? Of like, so how do you flip that over? How do you
build the
I'm
business
making
case
motions
for
with
it?
my hands for those not seeing the video. Yeah.
I see it happening because I see it happening in my work, and if I don't see it happening, I'm not doing my work. So that's the inevitable sales pitch here for reaching out if you want to see it happen live.
Yes. Yes. Hire Märtha.
Yeah, exactly. No, but you
is the
have
message.
to obviously know your audience. Like, there's some left brainies that need to see the data, and then there's the right brainies that understand just a pure sort of philosophy of course, our dreams about the future have an effect on our actions in the present. But it's a whole scientific field where we see this happening again and again. We call it performativity of expectations, or the sociology of expectations. If anyone wants to dive deep into that, it's in futures research.
And how does that work?
I'm sorry?
How does that work? Can you give some background maybe to people who might not be familiar
Yeah.
with that terminology?
So it's a whole phenomena that we're observing and trying to understand about how visions about the future impact and perform on our actions in the present. And that's the element when we try to work with futures, right? Is to on the one hand see what does the data support in terms of what is feasible, but then see, okay, but what happens when the visions are large enough and bold enough and brave enough, however ridiculous and impossible they seem now, what are the sociological effects that are happening? And you see this again and again. You know, you can take solar, which is one of those examples you talk about, Benjamin. The experts are getting it wrong all the time. You know, we've seen these graphs of International Energy Agency that have missed the mark every time, and they've missed the mark because they don't understand that there's a powerful story at the source of solar. It's we're the first generation to, you know, since Homo erectus, our cousins found fire some million years ago, are not going to burn energy for fire for, you know, burn stuff to get energy anymore. That's a powerful story. And then the next story is, you know, nuclear fusion. I don't understand why we talk about fission, because, you know, the story is about creating actual suns on Earth. And so what we're seeing first is these stories that attract the best brains in the world. So you see this in fusion versus fission. The best brains in nuclear power, they don't want to be in the old paradigm. Like, it's a kind of an ego thing. You know, do you want to be in that's so last century? They want to be in this new thing, fusion. And so that's the first phenomena you see happening around your visions. You see the brains that are attracted around you. And then after the brain, financial capital follows. And after financial capital, you know, you see these visions actually having a self-fulfilling prophecy, however ridiculous they started out. Solar in the 50s, ridiculous.
Who's doing it right in Europe? Not necessarily companies, but like which sectors, which industries get it, you would say?
I think there's I'm going back to quantum. I think there's a pretty powerful story around quantum in Europe at the moment, you know. Source of quantum thinking in many ways. I live in Copenhagen, you know, one of the most important scientists, Niels Bohr, So there's a powerful story around quantum. There's also a story around quantum computing as, that is something where we actually could win the race or be part of the race if you think that the AI race has gone. So that's a powerful story. I think there's a lot in the biorevolution as well, so a bio-based innovation, the life sciences, but we can be much, much better in Europe of how, again, coming back to how we
What's happening
globalize.
in bio and life sciences? Just like what do you see that's inspiring there?
I mean, and here we are when we talk about visions, and this is where it's, so important to have your organizations on board. So I will showcase what I think is exciting, but here comes the normative part, to be very open and blunt about, we all project our own utopias into tech and into innovations. And so my own is, I think it's incredibly interesting to follow the sort of value shift in innovators that are asking themselves, not to master nature, which was the paradigm of all the industrial revolutions until now, but how to mimic nature. This saying that nature is a 4 billion year old R&D department that has perfected all the solutions to our problems over 4 billion years. And I'm fascinated by all the innovators today that look towards nature to reverse engineer her solutions to all the problems that we have, and we're seeing it across the board. Quantum computing actually is a way to think like nature.
And I mean, one thing, one assumption that most people should find easier to give up now is that reality is pretty rigid, and if things change, they change gradually and they change bit by bit, and there's actually limits. And I think this goes for the scientific realm. It goes for the for international relations. One thing that Trump has done for us, I believe, is just to show how much is possible in a very short amount of time. Like how much, just if you just look at it in a way where you weigh up the amount of change that can be pushed through a system in a year, that is, I think, so much heavier than most people would have imagined possible. And like you said, and I think it's a kind of story that I also tell my kids before I tuck them in at night. If they have nightmares, they say there's these evil creatures and monsters and under the bed, and I say, well, the thing is, if there's monsters, that means all the superheroes are real too, right? You can't have it both ways. Like if the bad guys exist, the good guys exist. And I think the same is true in the realm of ideas, and the same is true in the direction that the system can swing. So if we can get this kind of fall off a precipice that we're seeing right now in international relations, if we can see these massive changes in the advance of AI and the like, that means there is the capacity for very, very large swings, and it must be necessarily there on the upside of things. So if we're thinking about how this happens, I think it's about concentration of effort. Like there's just a couple of people in the US who want to turn the US into an autocracy. There's a couple of people in Silicon Valley who just want to replace humans with machines as quickly as possible. If you look at it on the bright side of things, where would you say if we would have to concentrate our collective mind force, our collective energy and resources, what would be the target that is most realistic and most promising to say, okay, this is something, if we get this done, the impact would be exponential in the way that we have seen in these less optimistic areas.
I'm not going to get like a sector, like we talked about life science before, quantum. I'm more going to say like an area within ourselves and our sort of, all these technological revolutions, they require that we invest in our democratic institutions so that, the fruits are shared equally. And we tend to talk about the formal institutions, healthcare and education and, labor markets. And but less about the informal institutions. And so I think one of the major, most under-financed areas is investing in our fantasy and our imagination. That would be the best no regret move for EU to do. And we see it kind of, with the new Bauhaus initiative and things like that, but it's still very siloed. Sort of cross-industrial, cross-value chain, cross, all the disciplines, to invest in your own imaginative and then co-imaginative capacity. I think there's so much untapped there and such abundance to be found there. We're just, faced with increasingly wicked problems, and it feels that our collective hardened brain force is on the decline. Increasingly stressed, brain waves in beta mode, which is not conducive for creativity. So we need to really think long and hard about how we create the best hardened brain force for solving these insane problems coming at us. And imagination.
Yeah. I like investing in imagination or in art and creativity as a direction. I think that the problem that we often have is that people tend to have relatively modest expectations a lot of the time, especially when they're scared, right? Because the thing that most people want is just basic security, right? They want to know that no one will come and attack them, no one will burn their house down and take their stuff, right? That's like priority one. They want to know that their life will be sort of gradually predictable, that, the future will be slightly better than the present, but sort of, understandable, comprehensible to themselves. They want their children to have a slightly better life than themselves. And that's sort of your kind of conservative 101, if you already happen to have a relatively comfortable kind of middle class, upper class sort of life. But that's sort of your basic level that I think most people operate in. Like, if I can just have a comfortable, good life that gets gradually better, I know that I can send my children to a good school. I know that they'll take care of me when I'm older. And here we go. Like, so that's kind of a life that I think a lot of people are pretty happy strapping into. Now, of course, if you're being screwed over and you're angry at the system, then you're thinking, okay, I want to bring down the class structure. I want a revolution so I get more stuff too, right? So that I can climb up the ladder and get to a point, of this utopian vision. But if you think back to like Marxism, anarchism, all these things, like, what was their utopian vision? Their utopian vision was the 8-hour workday. Their utopian vision was healthcare for all. Their utopian vision was a classless society where everyone can be, can have leisure time and be free and to do stuff. So I think that when we have this concentration of mind force that Benny was talking about, and you just mentioned, of, Elon Musk saying, I want to buy a bunch of rockets and see if we can get to Mars, right? Or whatever the fuck Peter Thiel is talking about that seems pretty ridiculous. Like we want to replace the humans. Like, these are very specific, relatively sinister ideas, but they don't correspond to the thing that a lot of people tend to want, which is a secure, comfortable life. And it's kind of hard to make that sound sexy in a way. So I really like what you just said about investing in imagination and creativity and so on. But, we need to find a way to kind of raise the gears, in a way to raise the ante in terms of making that vision of the future more sexy, more appealing, more compelling. Kind of like the Americans and the French in their revolutions managed to kind of give me liberty or give me death. Sort of, that's very compelling. That's something you can get up in the morning for.
I can do without the death.
Yeah, I mean, preferably less death and more liberty, right? But like, it's sort of like, if I try and sell you something that is, can you just make me slightly more comfortable gradually over time? That's a lot less compelling than liberty or death, or like get to Mars at all costs. Like, how do we create that sort of urgency, that kind of very specific urgency? Let's
Maybe
say.
just to also add, to add to that. But yeah, I mean, I think like the question is also how do we bring that the urgency, but also like this entrepreneurial spirit, like this save the world before breakfast mentality that you were also saying, Märtha. How do we bring that? Because I think people are always going to revert to their like safety. You know, their 9 to 5 is safe. Like their social security is safe. Why take a risk outside of that? I don't know like how we can push that more. This like entrepreneurial spirit here. How do you like also see that in this world that is more like people are going to revert much more to this conservative, safe, like let me protect my space kind of mentality, and now we're asking them, take the risk. And I mean, do we have also like enough like the mentality? I don't know if it's also fully there yet. So it'd be interesting to hear from you like how to also like get that more in Europe, but also like the infrastructure. I mean, we talked a little bit about like your EU Inc., but like, do we have the full infrastructure to support people in their, first crazy thought before breakfast, and to really invest in their imagination and creativity? Like how do we operate? Basically, how do we make that operative, and what kind of like steps do we need to take in Europe to support people in that journey?
Lots of questions packed into all of this, and I don't know.
Easy stuff.
Yeah, this is definitely before breakfast material.
Yeah,
right?
definitely before breakfast. But I mean, listen, neurologically, we're unfortunately not wired to take risks either. Like neurologically, our brains are optimized to save energy. So, and that's for our survival in the short term, but for the long term, we need creative thinking. Like any new thought that is creative requires more energy for the brain. So it's taxing for our entire system to think creatively. So that's what we need to know, that creative thinking needs to be seen as a muscle that we train each day, because or else the brain will go back to sort of its highway normal thinking, because it's just trying to protect us, but it's not great for the humanity level long term, and we need these radical thoughts. And then it's sort of, okay, so we go back to this kind of what's the right level of radical, and sometimes, or often too often, those visions just talk into that, safety, and or we try to be a little bit visionary, but it's not, like for something to really change our longing for safety in a world, and especially in a media landscape that only sort of sells us and taps into our negativity bias, where its entire revenue models is wired to feed our negativity bias. The visions that will, galvanize the courage to drop that safety mentality need to be so far beyond, so much more brave and ambitious than the visions that we're seeing today. You mentioned Elon Musk, like, okay, it's not Mars. His vision is we need to be an interplanetary species, even intergalactic species. I mean, that
Amazing.
Is a vision, good or bad, but that is a vision. Just I rewatched.
It's not stupid. It's not irrational.
On YouTube, the chopstick landing of SpaceX, and they film inside the entire team that when that first chopstick landing happened, and when they made it happen, and just the energy in the room, and they streamed it. It has multi-million views, and who doesn't want to be part of that energy? And it's these sort of ridiculous hyperbolic visions. What are those for Europe? What are those for, we talk at the European level, what are those for organizations? And then we come back to very practical, the way that we do strategy, be it supranationally or nationally at sort of public sector level or in our companies, is still like not bottoms up by design. So we don't create that energy, that galvanizing energetic force. Often strategy is, too much so-called tier one consultants coming in and creating this, PowerPoint, and then we're trying to push it through the organization. So that's also one of those things that I work with, is that you have to open up the space for the entire organization, because it's such a missed opportunity if you don't get to release that sort of energy of the future when you do it right.
I would like to briefly sort of look towards Europe, because I think the Europeans, they have a very peculiar relationship with this kind of radicalism. Because on the one hand, we try to avoid it. We have a pretty bad history with radical thought, especially radical political thought. On the other hand, a lot of these innovative ideas like EU Inc., but then also almost everything that touches on defense and almost everything that touches on tech, and now also to a certain extent with the democracy shield that's supposed to protect democracy, they just kind of pretend that the radical thing has already been done. Because if you look at something like EU Inc., in the current configuration of the EU, it's bound to fail. Like, it can't work. There's nothing in there that tells you how sort of national tax authorities will, look at this regulation. They will suddenly no longer tell you to pay your taxes in their respective countries. Well, good chance. It's not going to happen. The same thing goes for the democracy shield. You build this thing, but you don't talk about how you give it funding. Like, where's the trillion euros over 10 years that you need to actually fund this fucking thing? Like, they do these things, but it's almost like they build and extrapolate from a status quo something that they know will only work if the radical thing somehow magically materializes. But then at the same time, nobody wants to touch the radical thing. Nobody wants to talk about questions of, for example, who is in charge? How does democracy work in Europe? What do we do with national sovereignty? These things we just sort of put in a box and we lock it in the drawer. But we still build our plans as if, something has fundamentally changed in the way that Europe operates. And then what happens is these initiatives tend to fizzle out because they were designed and built for a system that does not really exist yet. So to a certain extent, I think the question is, how do we get back to basics? Like, how do we sort of say, what are the actual preconditions? And you can do that in a million different areas, from defense procurement to how we what powers does the European Parliament have, and so on. How do you get back to really the ground truth of a situation we're in, and try to build the system out in a way that all of these nice innovations can actually function and can actually work? Because I think there's just a massive disconnect.
Can I add to that a bit? Because I mean, as a Brussels dweller, you kind of figure out after a while how this stuff works. I think that what you're saying, Benny, of like European policy makers, whether they're at leadership levels, politicians, or the civil service level, yes, they intentionally build lopsided systems or lopsided solutions, and they build solutions that lean forward and will kind of topple over if you don't build the next thing, right? So the existence of the euro as the currency, which is the famous example that is always given for this, assumes that there will also be a fiscal union, a tax union that will follow the currency union. The idea of having a currency union, a common currency, without having tax union makes no fucking sense and is a manifestly fucking crazy idea. But they said, the people who planned this explicitly thought, and they wrote this down and documented it very clearly. They said it would be so crazy to have a common currency without fiscal union that we will do the currency union and then reality will demand that the fiscal union will follow. But then, like many liberal utopians that have graced the previous centuries, they underestimated the powers of like entrenched national power and the sense of nationalism that people feel, and the ability of politicians to hold on to the powers that they have, so that currency union happened, but like fiscal union never followed yet, right? But then, like, what they do in Europe is to kind of assume that the next radical step is just bureaucracy, like that the thing that you're doing is just sort of like a technical detail. So what they did with support for Ukraine a few weeks back that no one is talking about because it doesn't matter, they basically said, we're going to give Ukraine 90 billion euros, and we're going to use European debt, common debt, so fiscal union basically, to do that. But we're not going to talk about it in any grand terms. We're just going to say this is a technical solution that we came up with one afternoon because no one else agreed on any other solution. So we just did fiscal union, but we're not going to say that because it's a technical bureaucratic detail and we don't want to freak you out. And so, but you do, within the Commission, within the Brussels bubble, there are people who are thinking, yes, this is fiscal union, let's go. And it was like a nationalist conservative who actually forced this, the Prime Minister of Belgium, who suddenly turned from being a staunch nationalist Eurosceptic into like a massive federalist in one afternoon because he wanted to save Belgium the money, or the legal risk rather. But it's sort of like this tension where you have this vision of the future, but you turn it into a very boring technocratic bureaucratic detail. And the question is, how do we turn it inside out so everybody sees the thing that actually just happened? I'm not giving an easy solution here or anything. I'm just describing the Brussels method that is sort of run its course in a way. Sorry to have perplexed you further.
No, it's great. I'm just thinking what the vision was, you're saying.
So the vision is a United States of Europe. The vision is to have one unified functioning Europe that has a common fiscal system and an ability to defend itself and to be sovereign. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that the member states go away; they'll stay there. But
I just
that's what the move is. But no one is making the case for it. They're just saying, "Well, we're going to support Ukraine." And the person who happened to propose it is also like a skeptical of it at the same time. It makes no sense. Mm-hmm. It's sort of happening by force of reality. Yeah, because there is no other way.
I mean, the Brussels apparatus, although I do work on enough for the whole circus, I was about to say. No, we love the circus. And this is your expertise, but it comes down to maybe semantics. I'm thinking, what is a vision? Yeah. How do we define a vision? When you say like a federal united Europe, is that a vision? Like, what does that mean for people who are Europeans? Like, how does that change their day to day? Like what? And I think this has been my driving force. Is I've worked from, we've all come out of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we talk about them as if they are visions, but there are just sort of 17 different colors and words, and then some sub-criteria. What is a vision, and how granular does it need to be to galvanize that kind of effect? And I think that's a discussion we need to have, because we take for granted that, a federal Europe that is going to be more sovereign in a way, that is a vision, I'm not sure it is.
Well, you may be right that it isn't. That could be, but it is a pretty clear sort of template for people who work in politics to say, I want to get here, in the same way. And this is where your point on imagination is really interesting, because when Elon Musk says, I want us to be an intergalactic species and I want to get to Mars, like, that's a vision in the sense that I can imagine it. I can see spaceships going to Mars. So in that sense, it's a lot more tangible. But how the fuck is that going to impact my life? Like, am I going to Mars? Do I want to go to Mars? I don't know. Maybe not on one of his ships. But like, how does it impact my life right now? And so if I'm in a position where, if I'm pissed off at the world and I'm about to lose my job and be replaced by a robot, and, I'm looking at all these billionaires buying out cities to have their weddings in and all this stuff that you're seeing, how does getting to Mars help me? So on the one hand, I feel galvanized by going to Mars and that sort of, compelling energy that you talked about being in the control room and being part of this great story. But at the same time, does it matter to me? Am I in this? Like, am I going to Mars? Is that really my priority, or do I need to just make rent and send my kid to school? And make
but I
breakfast.
think you're forgetting the nuances, because like the very important details. The fine script is that, it's not just going to Mars for the sake of Mars. It's because he believes that it's an existential risk for humanity to stay on this planet. So you're thinking about Ethan, your 2-year-old plus, and you're thinking that you're doing something to make sure that humanity survives, and the only way for us to survive truly on a planet where we're exposed to comets and whatnot is to make sure that we hedge our bets and therefore populate more planets and preferably more galaxies. So that's part of that vision. Which galvanizes,
which in the very long term is not stupid. I think sort of comparing a reform project like EU federalism to what Mr. Musk is selling is a bit of a category error, because and I think that's also why it's so difficult to make progress here. I think Märtha is right saying, what is the vision? How is this a vision? I don't think it is. It's plumbing. It's it's just if the US weren't built in the way that they are, with the access to capital and access to markets and just the general setup, it would be very difficult. You wouldn't get the kind of Elon Musk moonshots. You wouldn't get the scaling and the size, and that's also one of the reasons why we are utterly dominated by these people. So I think the question is not, how do you build this grand counter vision, but how do you build an ecosystem and a basis for people, to actually turn their visions into reality, to actually go from idea to realization. And that is sort of the hard daily slog of people who think about boring things like politics, like ourselves, unfortunately. And it's not always glamorous, and it's not always sexy. And I think the sort of this need we feel to make it sexy in order to compete with the fascists, I think that's a difficult thing to attain and a difficult thing to achieve. And I'm not entirely sure this is necessary. Where I want to get is not some, and I don't think that a new federated United States of Europe, that's going to be a utopia. I mean, it could turn out terribly, but it recreates a space, or it creates a space where you can actually realize utopian ideas, rather than having a great idea and inside a very small box and constantly running against walls and not having any opportunity to that thing to catch fire. And I think that's that's the first step. That's where we need to go if we want to do anything big in Europe. If we want to do anything big on the international stage in terms of geopolitics, if we want to do anything big in the tech space, if we want to do anything that really matters, it's we first have to get rid of the walls that sort of keeps everything in their little tiny nationalist boxes, and that is not super interesting and not super sexy, and it's quite technical, but yet it needs to get done. And I think we need to, maybe we can borrow a bit from the visions to that then can be realized without trying to oversell what this will do for people in their daily lives just by the virtue of having achieved that.
Yeah.
Maybe to add to that thought about Europe too. I mean, I think the issue is why we're not seeing, or the average person doesn't see Europe as something so visionary, is that they see it more as like the complaint box. So it's where the starting point is somewhere different. They're like, this just happened now, Russia just invaded Ukraine. Russia is interfering in our elections. Well, where is Europe? Where is Europe to do something? It's always the question after the fact. It's always after the issue has been raised, or after we're in a moment of crisis. Like, where is now Europe? So it's more like the complaint box. Europe should do something about that. That's like what you'd hear the average person saying. It's not, the starting point is not then like, okay, well, let's build a Europe who's ready and prepared to to act and, react to those things, be proactive rather than always react. And so I think that's our dilemma in Europe a bit, is that our starting point with the average person is not there in a moment for creativity and for visionary and imagination. It's very much from the point of complaint box. Well, where's Europe in all of this anyway?
And to that, what is Europe? I mean, when multilateralism, which Europe is in a way, we become the meeting in the middle and the meeting of least common denominators, instead of, is there a time to, lean into our differences in Europe? We are far more different than all the states in the US. Like, by miles. All of the members.
Sure, if you compare New York to Louisiana, I'm not actually too sure that the differences are that much more pronounced. Linguistically, maybe.
No,
but
Benjamin, look at the member list. Look at our member states. Travel to the outskirts, beyond the capitals.
Yeah, true.
I mean, let's just wake up and then from there, what's the strength in that? And I think that's a really untapped potential, to leaning into our differences, not trying to smooth them over with something in the middle.
Yeah, I think leaning into differences is all well and good. I think that the big thing at stake here, and we can place that where we want on the sort of the vision to boring template kind of spectrum, is that if we want to live free, prosperous lives as Europeans, we have to do it within a large functioning European Union, or else we will simply be enslaved by the other autocratic powers of the world, which will just come and take our stuff and put us in a box, basically. And that's what they're actively doing right now. So we can. I'm not sure I fully agree with Benny about the fact that, reform must necessarily be boring. I mean, I understand what technocrats are trying to do when they make it sound boring. I think that there were some really exciting nation-building initiatives like, India coming together, Germany coming together, Italy coming together as countries. And those were all very kind of exciting, compelling causes, which normally, freedom and all of these sort of really important values were a part of it. So I think there is an exciting vision of a better life that Europeans want for themselves, should want for themselves. I don't think that politicians are trying even to explain it in that way. And indeed, how do you compare that to, we keep referring to Musk. You could also refer to Kennedy to refer to someone less annoying, but, going to the moon by the end of the decade, that's the other kind of equivalent to the Mars thing that's going on now. How do you focalize your effort in that sense? And I think that's somewhere where we just need to kind of have an agreement. Someone needs to stand up and give the equivalent of we're going to the moon, or kind of have brand new energy. Everyone will have green energy or fusion energy or whatever it is, preferably something that we can visualize.
The equivalent is enlargement. It's enlargement because the technocrats and all of the experts in the EU is saying, we're going to enlarge by 2030. We're getting 2 new member states by 2030, Montenegro, Albania, they're the front runners. You say this to somebody in, rural France, they'll be like, I don't know where these countries are. I don't know anything about them. They're supposed to now become members. We're not really selling the idea of enlarging. We're thinking, what is Europe? Well, Europe at the borders of the European Union, Europe as a continent, Europe at, we're not really also telling that story for a lot of people. And then the only time they're going to be confronted with it, Europe has now enlarged, we have 2 new members, is when it's going to be already decided on the table. And I think it's not going to be any good for our European project, our European identity. I think enlargement is the one the one that's right there. It's something like 80% of Greeks say that they're not aware of the enlargement process or where we are in Europe, or that Europe is even, Brussels is even considering enlarging. Greece, like the neighbors of these countries that are probably going to be next to join. I think the only time this is really starting to be on the table is, again, in a moment of crisis, which is then Russia invades Ukraine. Ukraine's now on the table. We have to bring them into Europe, like to save Europe, and that's like, I think, the only time people were really confronted with this in the last, 15 years. So it's, I think we're going to have a big problem if in 4 years' time we expand by a couple new member states, and then a big part of the population is not just that they're not ready for that, but they have just not been confronted or introduced to that idea, because so much of it has been Brussels talk and, enlargement forums and summits and so on. And beyond that, the average person just had no idea that we're now enlarging our union.
And you see this across the board, like I alluded to before as well. You see it, in the corporate sector as well, with these so-called visions, where you don't get the organization with you, but it's pushed from top down. So yeah, and that you're bound to create big conflicts, obviously, when you don't get them.
I feel like we should be organizing some therapy roundtables for visionary leaders with vision issues.
That's just something I want to end off with a little bit is how deep do we dare to go and how bad it can become? Because that's part of these big visions. And you just mentioned before, the European project is, important because of and then, the big technocrats in the US, like we've even in this talk, we are a reaction to the US, to Trump. We had to mention Trump. I'm like, God damn it. When I heard you, Benjamin, doing it, I was like,
sorry.
Oh, can we just go an hour without, So we are ourselves a reaction. And I think I see this as well in artificial intelligence. We think that the existential risk that Jeffrey Hinton talks about is, labor markets and jobs disappearing. And as we mentioned before, robots replacing humans and our jobs and our safety. He asks of us to go even deeper. It's not that. He calls those catastrophe, not existential risks. And I think those visions that we want and we so long for and hunger for, they will only be as bright and light as the amount of darkness we allow ourselves to sit in. And just talking about, being a reaction to technocrats or to autocracies, we need to go even deeper than that. Elon Musk does it when he wants to go to Mars. That vision, wherever it appeals to you or not, comes out of actually sitting in how dark it could become if the wrong comet hits us at the wrong time. So that's the work that needs to be done. And I think that kind of leads into therapy, Omri, because I think we're all individually feeling it. And that's super scary. And we don't go there. And then we just sort of still stimulate our systems with the news, but we don't create these collective pockets where we can grieve together and check into actually what we're about to lose and what is really on the table here.
And the insane thing is that we don't even need to imagine, this darkness, because it fucking happened. Like, it's not that long ago.
Yeah, it happened to our grandparents.
The absolute descent into, max darkness actually occurred and actually took place. And we can, obviously we can imagine new variations of this, but in the end, it's always, mass death brought to people at the hands of, out of control systems or technology. Like, this is,
and lunatic people with power.
Lunatic people with power. So I think even if we have a massive lack of imagination, a first step could be to point people to the lived reality of 2 generations past, and that will never be a perfect analogy, and stuff doesn't repeat. The nature of the threat might be different, but the ultimate experience that people might have to go through, from camps to executions to being classified as redundant or whatever it is very similar, and that needs to be needs to sink in a bit more. I think that this is the scale and the scope of the threat we're facing, and then finding a way out of it and thinking your way out of it is no longer an indulgence. It's simply a necessity. It's simply the only way forward. So I think I'm sitting quite deeply in that darkness already. So I hope that's a good start. It's actually making me
I find this really encouraging. Usually I get into trouble for being too doomy and gloomy and apocalyptic, but now now it's encouraging.
It's just the start of something.
Now it's a recipe. So I'm very happy about that.
Good.
Yeah,
Yes.
and now that
So,
we've stretched our sort of emotional spectrum in the direction of the darkness, then the next exercise is to see how far we can stretch it on the other side towards the light, to use the dark and light analogy, however faulty that is.